2 years ago this month, Dr. Fauci has put on notice that the virus most likely came from a lab that was doing gain-of-function research. He gets a letter on January 31st, 10:32 p.m. 2020. He gets an email, from Dr. Christian Anderson that says, the virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. Dr. Fauci goes into complete overdrive to cover this information up and not present it to the American people. He organizes a conference call the next day with Fauci, Collins, and 11 virologists from around the world on that call. Dr. Gary on that call says this: I don't know how this happens in nature, but it would be easy to do in a lab. 4 days later, those people who express those sentiments start to change their position. They write a piece in Nature Medicine magazine on February 16th. It first gets published online. That piece is then cited on February 9th, 2020 in the now famous letter in The Lancet that becomes the gospel that this thing, according to Fauci and this group, didn't come from a lab. All that happens in 20 days. So they go from this thing looks engineered, this thing is not consistent with evolutionary theory, this thing could not have happened in nature, this thing would be easy to do in a lab, to completely changing their position. And here's the kicker. The two guys who said those things, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, 3 months later get rewarded with an $8.9 million grant from Dr. Fauci to continue to do research on coronavirus. I mean, I think there's a couple obvious questions that should have been, that should have happened 2 years ago this month. Why didn't Dr. Fauci, when he first got put on notice that this was happening after that conference call on February 1st, why didn't he notify the commander-in-chief? We have no evidence that he talked to the President of the United States. We have no evidence that he talked to any of his bosses. He spent the time trying to change the narrative. Dr. Fauci got a chance to edit the very article that became the basis for the letter in The Lancet, which, as again, we all know, became the gospel that this couldn't have come from a lab according to these experts. So I think those are important questions. If, in fact, the American people put us back in charge, this will be something that we will spend a great deal of time getting to the bottom of. I want to thank my colleague, Ranking Member Comer, for the letter that we put out last week that begins to highlight this and uncovered the redacted emails where we now know what Dr. Gary said when he said this thing had to have come from nature. So I think this is important. We will continue to work on this this year as much as we can. But again, the obvious question, I'll leave you with this. The obvious question is, why don't Democrats want to know this? Why don't they want to know how the virus started that has disrupted our lives for now almost a full 2 years? Why don't they want to know? Why don't they want to do the investigation? Why won't they call in these virologists, Dr. Gary, Dr. Anderson, who initially said this thing came from a lab? They won't do it. That's a question that needs to be answered. Mr. Comer.